All right, number 18. Sorry about my voice, everybody. So, if the government increases its funding for civilian scientific research, private patrons and industries will believe that such research has become primarily the government's responsibility. So, we're saying that if, which introduces a sufficient condition. So, if the government increases its funding for this civilian scientific research, so if we increase the funding, so increase the money, then we're saying that the private patrons and industries will believe that the research has been the primarily government's responsibility. So that's what people are going to believe. When they believe that research is no longer primarily their own responsibility, private patrons and industries will decrease their contributions towards research. So saying like, hey, if they now think that the government is the primarily responsibility and that it's no longer their primarily responsibility, then they will decrease their contributions. Therefore, in order to keep from depressing the overall level of funding for civilian scientific research, the government should not increase its own funding. All right, so our conclusion is the government should not increase its own funding. And we're saying that because if we increase our funding, then people are going to think that the government's the primarily responsibility. Um, and we want to keep from decreasing the overall level of funding in general for civilian scientific research. Um, we know that this is a necessary assumption question because it has assumption and relies. And so this is a top-down question, and we're going to look for something that is needed in order for a conclusion to be true. An unsaid premise, in other words, an unsaid premise that is needed. So A says government should bear the majority of the financial burden of funding for science. No, we're saying that government should not increase its own funding. So we're not, nowhere do we say that government should bear the majority. So it's not going to be A. B says any increase in government funding would displace more private funding for civilian scientific research than it would provide. I like B so far. I know that we typically want more mild answer choices on necessary assumption, but what this is saying is like, hey, if the government funding goes up at all, then um yeah, so if any increase of any government funding goes up, then it would displace more private funding from the civilians. So they're saying that because the government funding went up, whatever that amount is, would then in turn there would be less money overall. So whatever amount the citizens and the industries gave would decrease, so there would be a lesser amount. And so yeah, B I think would have to be true. C, private donations towards research are no longer welcomed by researchers. No, that has nothing to do with it. Primary donations are no longer welcome. No. D, civilian scientific research cannot be conducted efficiently with more than one. No. What does the the research being conducted efficiently have to do with there being more than one source? All we're trying to say is the government, why shouldn't the government increase their funding? E, funding for civilian scientific research is currently at the highest possible level. No, the funding does not need to be at the highest possible level in order for the government to not have to increase its own funding. Maybe the government should not increase its own funding, but next year, industries and civilians also give more money. So that's why it wouldn't be E. And so that is why our answer is going to be B.